Hey there, and welcome to Everything Church Pro. Today I'm going to be walking you through how to make a sermon in Logos, and I'm just literally going to make this Sunday's sermon in front of you, and I don't know how it's going to go. And so I encourage you, if this is a blessing, hit that like button and that subscribe button. Join us because the goal of Everything Church Pro is simply to help you study the Bible, serve in your church like never before. And so if you're somebody who loves the local New Testament church, join this growing community and be gracious to me. So a couple of weeks ago or months ago, I made a video about how to make a sermon in Logos, and I just covered the high level. And you can watch that video and get the cliff notes if you want. It's probably about a 15 to 17 minute video. And in that video, I asked if you want to see a full length, me making a sermon in front of you, comment down below. And I got a lot of comments of people saying, hey, make a sermon in front of us, just do it live. And I tried doing it once before a couple of months ago, and it was just hard. So I don't even know if this is going to work, because making a sermon is something very private and spiritual. And so I may not be talking for some of it. I might just be focusing. I might look up every once in a while and comment on why I just did what I did. But I'm going to just lay it open for you. You're going to be able to follow along, and I'm going to have to put this on Do Not Disturb. But follow along, and if you pick up some tips and tricks along the way, you're going to see my thought process for making a sermon, and we're just going to make the rough draft together. And so we're going to jump into Logos together, and this is going to be a long haul. So maybe watch the short version first, and then if you enjoyed that, you can come back and watch this long version, because I don't know how long this is going to be, but we're going to jump right into it. And so I'm going to switch over to the screen here. And here's Logos Bible Studies. This is what happens right when you open it up. My wife is actually teaching at a ladies' Bible study tomorrow, and so she's got hers. I've had her working in Logos as well. She's doing great. But what I do to start off is I will open up the Bible right here, and I will drag that over to this side. That's my favorite side. And then I'll come to the Sermon Manager, and I'll come up here, and I will push the date. So that's for this Sunday, the 28th. And then I push add. This gives me an opportunity to write out the title. Right now, I'm just going to put Romans. Oh my goodness, which part of Romans am I in? Romans, I think we're in chapter 14 or 15 right now. And so let's see, Romans 14. We talked about that last week. Okay, so I don't know if we got deeply into that section. Let me just see. Yep, we talked about that. Boom. So I think we are here at chapter 15, verse 14. So I'm just going to put Romans 15 for now. I can change the title later. Romans 15, the series is Romans. So it's going to link it up with all my other Romans ones. I can put in here Romans 15. That is the passages. Then I'll come down here, which is super awesome for keeping everything organized. It will just have this is something that I use so often. So if I preach out, I'll push add occasion. I can put another occasion right there. And then you just push open, and it opens it up for you. Okay, so now that I'm here, I'm getting ready to preach this. What I do here for heading 1 is I put intro and push enter. And then I just take some time and I read through the text and I see if there's any big takeaways, and I do my sermon scribbles over here. If you've taken our Preaching and Teaching Made Simple course, you know that I do sermon scribbles, which are low pressure, rough observations of the text that I put out here. And so I'm just going to read through and see if there's anything that sticks out as I read this section. Okay, so I was reading through this, and maybe you were reading along as well. So I'll just kind of tell you what I was thinking as I was reading through it. I'm trying to jump back into the flow of thought in Romans, and I see here he's just got done talking about basically Christian liberty and how do we get along when we don't agree. And this is him explaining why he went through this. It seems like he says, "And I myself also am persuaded of you, my brethren, that ye also are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, able also to admonish one another." And so I just want to look up that word, admonish. And so let's just wait. Since I'm streaming, it's putting a little more tax on my system than usual. But here it says, this word means to admonish, to instruct, to warn. And so it seems as though Paul right here is saying that he is fully confident that even in that local church, they are able to teach each other, that this letter, they probably could teach themselves this if it was necessary. But he says, "Nevertheless, even though I know you could teach yourselves these things, I have written the more boldly unto you in some sort, as putting you in mind, because of the grace that is given to me of God, that I should be the minister of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles, ministering the gospel of God, that the offering up of the Gentiles might be acceptable, being sanctified by the Holy Ghost." And so it seems like he's saying the reason I'm writing this, even though you could probably teach yourselves this, is because this is the calling God has placed on my life to be the apostle to the Gentiles. That's my job, and you guys are Gentiles, and so I take this very seriously. It seems from first reading that's what he's saying. He says, "I have therefore," these are key words, "I have therefore whereof I may glory through Jesus Christ in those things which pertain to God. For I will not dare to speak of any of those things which Christ hath not wrought by me, to make the Gentiles obedient by word or deed." This is really a key sentence. This is why I believe he hit on Christian liberty. He says, "I'm not going to speak of any of those things which Christ hath not wrought by me, to make the Gentiles obedient by word and deed." This is what he's saying. He's saying, the reason I'm talking about liberty in Christ in the last section is because I'm not going to make you obey the Jewish laws if God hasn't told me that you need to obey the Jewish laws. That's what I believe he's saying here is, I'm not going to put anything more on you than the gospel needs to put on you. And he says, "Through mighty signs and wonders by this power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem around about to Illyricum, I have fully preached the gospel of Christ." Again, restating the theme of the entire book. "So I have strived to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build upon another man's foundation. But as it is written, to whom he was not spoken of, they shall see, and they that have not heard shall understand." And so let's see what text. That's Isaiah 52:15. Let's just look at that. See if it will actually let me click on this. "So shall he sprinkle many nations. The kings shall shut their mouths at him. For that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall consider." And so here we see, again, it's about the servant. "My servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled, be very high. As many as were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. And so shall he sprinkle many nations, and the kings shall shut their mouths at him. For that which had not been told them shall they see." And so he's talking about, in context, about the Messiah, and he's bringing up an Old Testament text, and that's why he really values his ministry to the Gentiles. And so he's going out and he's spreading out the good news where people had not heard the good news before. And he says, "But he's been hindered from coming to them, for which cause also I've been much hindered." And I believe the cause is him going to where there were no local churches. There was a local church in Rome, but there were other places where there had not been local churches. And he says, "That's why I've been hindered in coming to you. But now having no more place in these parts, and having a great desire these many years to come unto you, whensoever I take my journey into Spain, I will come to you, for I trust to see you in my journey." And he also says, "To be brought on my way thitherward by you, if first I be somewhat filled with your company." He's really talking about them providing financial support, food support, lodging support, whatever it is, to actually help him make it to Spain. He's asking for support. And he doesn't even ask for it. He just says, "I know that you're going to help me. You're going to help me get to Spain so I can share the gospel there. He says, but now I go into Jerusalem to minister unto the saints, for it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. And it hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal things. Again, this is a principle that Paul speaks about very often, about those who teach the Bible, who help in spiritual matters, should also receive financial support. And so here he's talking about the church at Jerusalem. They were actually in struggles at that moment. And so he says, it's because of the church at Jerusalem that you guys are even here. And so because of that, you guys are obligated to help them out with carnal things, since they helped you out with spiritual things. And it says, when therefore I have performed this and have sealed to them this fruit, I will come by you into Spain. And I am sure that when I come unto you, I shall come in the fullness of the blessing of the gospel of Christ. Now I beseech you, I beg you, I ask you, brethren, for the Lord Jesus Christ's sake and for the love of the Spirit, that ye strive together with me in your prayers to God for me, that I may be delivered from them that do not believe in Judea, and that my service which I have for Jerusalem may be accepted of the saints, that I may come unto you with joy by the will of God, and may with you be refreshed. Now the God of peace be with you all. Amen. Okay, so this is such an interesting one that I'm mulling over in my mind right now, because as we look at this, this is not a normal message, text. So truthfully, if we would have done last week's, it would have been a lot easier to make this video, because this one doesn't have like a clear, easy message point. But as I'm looking at it, I'm just going to write down a couple of things that are just sticking out to me, some points that he makes in this passage. I'm just going to write them down. Let me just see here. So as I'm looking at the flow of thought here, this is just me roughly outlining the text as I'm looking at the major movements. And my goal now is to look for the CIT, or the central idea of the text. What's the central idea of this passage here that I'm going to take now and structure the entire message around? It looks like, and this is the hard part, because I'm looking here and I'm seeing a lot about, it's really a personal section of the letter where he speaks about how much he wished he could have made it to this church already, and why he hasn't made it to that church. And so there's just a lot of random things in there, which is making me struggle to find the central idea, which it's going to take a little bit of thinking. So if I'm quiet for a second, That's why. And I may edit this out. I may not. I may force you to sit awkwardly with me as I think through this text, just trying to show you the reality of making a sermon as we study this. Because sometimes people think that making a sermon is just you sit down and you write a couple of notes down and boom, you're done. You just get up there and preach it. And sometimes there are messages that come super quickly and they're easy and it just flows. Sometimes it takes a lot of study and meditation. I should say every sermon takes a lot of study and meditation, but sometimes the sermon you're preaching has been studied out throughout your life. The meditation has happened throughout your life and just the course of your life, and so it just flows when it's time to write. This is a section of text that's going to take me a minute before I get into the flow, and I'm just trying to figure out what's the main push, what's the main idea here that he's talking about. Okay, so this is me. I'm writing out the central idea and I'm seeing if all of these smaller ideas fit into that larger idea, which it seems like they do fit into the centrality of preaching the gospel. And when you have, I apologize for coughing into the mic, but when you have a central idea, all of your other points should be connected to it. This is an error that a lot of early preachers make, is they just, every point is almost its own sermon, and you don't know why we're talking about this and then this and then this. It's the goal of us as the preachers to unify our message to say one thing. And the one thing that I'm thinking right now this message is about is the centrality of preaching the gospel, how important the preaching of the gospel really is. And I think that's the main thrust of this section of the text. The goal here is not for me to figure out what do I want to talk about. The goal for me is to figure out what is Paul talking about here. And I think he's talking about the centrality of preaching the gospel. If we look here at verses 19 and 20, we see here that he says that I have fully preached the gospel of Christ. Yea, so I have strived to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build upon another man's foundation. As you continue on, you see that it says that we are debtors, for if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister to them in carnal things. And so it seems like, again, he's hitting the note of, because of the Jews, and number one, obviously their Jewish history, like the gospel came through the Jews. That's why it's our duty to also help them in carnal things. Again, coming back to the gospel. And he says here again, when I come to you, he says, I'm sure that I'm going to come in the fullness of the blessing of the gospel of Christ. I'm going to need to study that out some more, but again, he's hitting the gospel. And then again, he hits at the very end the need for prayer for deliverance. Why? That he can come back and be with them by the will of God, and then go on to Spain to preach the gospel. And so, as we know, this prayer request was big, but he had already been told. We don't know if he had been told yet or not that he was going to be bound. That's in Acts, that when he goes back there, he's going to be bound and he's going to be hauled away. And yet he says, none of these things move me. Neither count I my life dear unto myself. And so we know that at some point he knew he was going to be captured. And I don't know if this is like a David and his first child situation, where David, even though God had told him his child would die, for up until the moment his child died, he kept praying. And maybe that's going on here. Maybe he already knew that he was going to be bound, but he's like, hey, be praying that that doesn't have to happen. Even Jesus, knowing that he had to be crucified, prayed, Lord, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me, but not as I will, but thine be done. And that could be what's going on here. And so I hope you're seeing the thought process that's going on as I'm studying the text and I'm writing out these rough things. I'm seeing the centrality of the gospel. And so even when it comes to verse 18, he's trying to show them that it's not about being Jewish, that he doesn't want to put the Jewish customs on top of the Gentiles, because the gospel is what matters here. Now, does that mean, and we'll probably type this out in a minute, does that mean that there's nothing that we should do? There's no holiness that we should keep? And here's another thing. Does that mean that there's nothing extra biblical that we should commit our lives to? Some people, it's like, if it's not in the Bible, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to live and do whatever I want. And yet it's very clear in the passages before that we are to limit our liberty for different reasons. I'm not going into that today, but it's not just a libertarian kind of theology where it's just anything goes if it's not expressly stated in the Bible as wrong. That's not the way Christians are supposed to live. Again, that's not the purpose of this video. I'm not going to teach you about that. If you want more of my views on that, comment below, ask me questions, or watch our sermon when we talked about how to get along when we don't agree. Okay, so now we're at a spot where I have a little bit of a rough idea, and I want to really flesh out the SITs. So the CIT is, I believe, the gospel, the preaching of the gospel is, and I don't want to say the most important until I really think about it, but it's one of the most important things of the Christian life. Ministering the gospel of God, preaching the gospel of God. It's so important. It's so important. And so I will turn that CIT into a purpose statement in a minute, but let's just see if we can make SITs out of this list of 5 things. The local church knew the gospel and could preach it themselves. Okay. Paul still wrote this letter because he was called by God to. Paul was hindered in visiting because he knew how important it was. Really, I do think these 3 in the middle could almost be condensed into one about how Paul knew how important the gospel was. And because he knew how important it was, he wrote this letter, even though he knew they could teach themselves. And because he knew how important the gospel was, he was more concerned about preaching the gospel where nobody else had heard it than going to Rome. Because Paul knew how important the gospel was, he knew he needed financial support to go and preach it where it hadn't been named yet, in Spain. And so that could be that. So let's just write this down. All right, so that's my rough SITs right now. I want to make them more pointed towards the listener. Right now, they're just kind of statements. I want to see here. All right, so here's my modification of the SITs. Our church, sorry, I hit the mic again. Our church is responsible to preach the gospel. And so I'm making the SIT very pointed to the people I'm speaking to, which is my local church here. Here he's speaking to the church at Rome in verse number 14 about how they could admonish one another. I want to take this and apply it to us. And so my SIT is our church is responsible to preach the gospel. We are supposed to teach one another about the gospel. We are supposed to preach it. The second one was Paul was fully committed, but I wanted to take an example from that and say, okay, each of us must be fully committed to preaching the gospel. So not only as a whole are we responsible for preaching the gospel, but individually, each of us must be committed to going out and preaching the gospel. And then that last one is prayer is the most valuable aid to preaching the gospel. And so I see these 3 SITs, which I think is going to be the structure of the sermon. And so once you get to this place, what I like to do is to preach it to myself basically, but type out the entire message. And so I'm actually going to do something. I'm going to take this and I'm just going to copy this or cut it actually. I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to, let's find a note. And let's just make a new note here. And it's going to put it in Sermon Scribbles. And I wonder if we can make this 14. Boom. So now it's anchored to that. And I just put in all of those notes I just copied from that. Okay, so now that's somewhere. So if we ever need to reference it again, we just click on that and it'll bring it all up here. You can change the color of the notes if you want to, but now that's going to be somewhere we can reference. So the CIT, oh, here we go. All right, so that's a rough CIT. I might finesse that. Let us jump into this. Okay, so the introduction, I have a video on how I structure sermons, and I encourage you to go watch that. It's got a downloadable for you as well. And in that video, you'll be able to see exactly my thought process, and hopefully that's a blessing to you. If you want, you can also join our Preaching and Teaching Made Simple course, which is in the university. You know, I'm supposed to take it off of the $49 a month, which hopefully I'll do the next day or two, and then turn it into a waiting list to get in, or $49 a year, not a month. And so if you want to jump in before I change it, there's the link down below for you to jump in, take our Preaching and Teaching Made Simple course, take our 40-day reset, all those things. But I'm not going to really tell you everything that I'm doing. I'm going to do my best to not hold anything back, but I might miss some things. That's all I want to say. But if you want like a really high level view of those, that's where that is. And so the introduction, I'm going to start preaching this to myself, and I'm going to try to think about the audience. And from the very beginning, I want them to know where we're going. So that's my purpose here at the outset. And so the CIT is more for me, but I'm going to look at here and just start figuring out how I'm going to connect this to the people here. And often I like starting it off with a question or a bold statement. So I'm going to think about that for a second. That's another cool feature. Just type the reference in, and immediately it makes a slide and brings in the the text, so you don't have to type it out yourself. So that's a cool thing. That's a good quote right there. So this right here is one of the most key phrases, and it really just breaks down exactly what you're going to be giving them, this one phrase. And so I want to make sure I frame it right. This is how all of these three link together, basically. Are they reasons? Are they steps? Are they truths? And that's what I'm trying to think about. I like that one. And this is kind of the springboard for the rest of the sermon. And so the first reason the gospel should be a priority in your life is blank. The second reason the gospel should be a priority in your life is blank. The third reason is blank, which it doesn't really work as well for the last one, so I might need to rephrase that. But let's just dive into it right now. And so what I do is I push 1, and then I select this, go up here, push heading 1, and now it's a heading. It'll make a slide for it. And then I can dive in. And so what I like to do sometimes here, it depends. Like right now I'm going through a series, so our church knows a lot of the context. But usually in my first points when I start breaking into the context of the text that I'm speaking on. And so let me just dive in. And again, so just a precursor. So if you haven't watched our other videos on this, the goal is this. Ready? Explain, illustrate, apply, transition. That's a good formula for each of these SITs to follow. And so right now I'm in the explaining phase. So I've just got done doing a lot of the explaining. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for an illustration here. And I'm also going to be thinking if there's any personal illustration that I have. And I often come to sermonillustrations.com. I'm just going to look up teaching. I'm just going to see if there's anything that fits here. That's a good one. I like that one. The first one. This is interesting just to think about. I don't think it really fits as an illustration, but he's talking about the different ways adults versus young people learn, but it doesn't really fit in the flow right here. This one does, and I might change it later, but I'm just going to put here this and select it. Illustration. I'm going to kind of help us flow into it. Oh, my wife's calling. Let me do something here. So, if she texts back, I might pause this for a second and talk to her if it's an emergency. But the reason I chose this one is it shows how important teaching is, and the goal is to help my people understand that we as a local church, we are responsible to teach the gospel as a church. This is something really important. And so, very important there. So, I'm now going to try to transition out of that. Sorry, trying to type while also reading what my wife's writing. All right. So I'm going to Actually, let me see if I can go back to the to Ecamm here. So I'm gonna pause this, talk to my wife for a second, and then I'll jump back in. But you guys are an hour into it. Hopefully, you guys are following along. Grab some coffee, and we'll jump right back in. Okay, so I am back, just making sure this is recording, and so let's jump back in. We're kind of here at I threw this verse in at the end because it's a verse that just came out in my mind about admonishing one another, and it's a privilege, and we do this admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Sing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. It's our responsibility to teach each other. So right now I'm in the application phase. Let me see here. Hebrews 5. It's very end. He says, for the time when you ought to be teachers. Oh, I'm in 6 now. Now, one trick I've learned is when I bring one of these in, it's so much text on one slide that I'll go through and I will begin to push enter where the verse breaks are so that it kind of breaks them up on different pages. Let's see here. And now there's 4 different slides with each verse. So this is the transition statement. I usually at the end, I'll do a summary after I've applied it to our local church. I'll summarize the point again, and then I'll transition. And I'm telling you, this is one of the easiest transitions, not only, and then say the first point, but also, you can say, but also. And so let me just look at how I phrase this again up here. The second reason the gospel should be a priority in your life. Okay, so you've seen, let me actually come back to eCam here. You've seen how I've done this first point, and I'm going to repeat this for step 2 and step 3. Truthfully, this video will become very, very long, and truthfully, if you guys want to see one where I do the entire sermon and it's like 3 hours long, you guys can comment down below, and I might do that again. I know that at this moment, my wife is needing some help, and she's actually working on her lesson. So she's teaching that tomorrow, and I'm teaching this on Sunday. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to push pause on this. I have the main ideas. I kind of got the flow of thought. I'm going to jump back into this at another time so I can go and help her. But I'm thankful for you guys, and I want to hear your questions. I want to hear your thoughts. This is the rough draft, and so this is how I do it, literally. When I'm doing a rough draft, I just go through and I basically preach it in my heart and in my mind, and I just preach it out. And then what I'll do is after I get the rough draft done later today, I'm going to preach through it. I'm going to put it on my iPad, which the nice thing about Logos is it's on everything. So it updates everywhere. It's on my phone right now. It instantly, every time, it just updates wherever I'm at. And then I'll bring my iPad into the pulpit in the auditorium, and I'll just preach through it. And I'll kind of go through it, and I'll see, okay, that illustration doesn't fit. That quote doesn't fit. This wording's clunky. It doesn't quite flow. And I want to do that 2 or 3 or 4 times before I actually preach it on Sunday, so that when I'm preaching, I can really be engaged with the people and be led by the Holy Spirit. If you don't run through it and you just type it all out, you're going to be glued to your notes the entire time. But when you preach through it a few times in practice, you get it so much into your own heart and into your own life that the notes are just there to kind of guide you along the way, but you're able to be led of the Spirit in the pulpit, and it makes a big difference. And so I encourage you, if this was a blessing to you, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. My goal is just to be a blessing to you and your service in your local church, and I'll see you guys in the next video.